If I've got a niche, let's say, for example, I've got the Ice Age. When I've got the Ice Age, woolly mammoths emerge and are successful. But when the Ice Age ends and we have a warm period, woolly mammoths go away. And it really doesn't matter what the woolly mammoths want to do. If the niche has changed, the niche has changed. Those institutional structures, music industry, banking, pharmaceuticals, medical, it doesn't matter. Effectively all institutional structures that evolved in the niche of scarce information are almost always going to be quite significantly unfit for the emergent niche of abundant information.
I guess I hadn't stopped to think that the reason why politics seems so crazy right now is that the governing that they're trying to do across the wealthiest parts of our country, the huge institutionalized things like media and music and money and pharma and education and transportation, are in fact becoming super decentralized and hard to govern. All the money and power and control of those things are not being held nearly as tightly as they used to be. We've all watched the disintegration of power across many of these different institutions. So it's no wonder, as each one of them begins to fall, that they all fall prey to the same decentralization of power. It for sure makes you stop and think about where everything's headed. I know that's not what I had signed up for when I initially started to talk to Jordan Greenhall. I thought we were going to talk about nootropics and smart drugs, and that's where we started. But in short order, Jordan aimed the conversation at the dead center of these trends. I was first made aware of Jordan and the Neurohacker Collective at a podcast dinner and recording for Wim Hof that Chris Ryan and I did. And some of his folks from the Neurohacker Collective were brought along by some Stanford researchers. Jordan was one of the co-founders of Divx. He also was at mp3.com. And the guys dabbled in just about anything you could possibly imagine, from philosophy to role-playing games, with most of his interests coming back to the coevolution of human civilization and technology. Jordan has come to the conclusion that humanity is in the midst of a world historical transition. And as he put it, it's likely to kill us all, like Mad Max, or maybe see us in an amazing future like Star Trek. Either way, humans are going to need a significant upgrade to our consciousness. And that's what the Neurohacker Collective is focused on. You may have heard of their product Qualia, a popular nootropic that boosts your mental capacity. I know for sure it felt like my brain got an upgrade, and yours will feel that way too at the end of this show. This is Grow Big Always. I'm Sam Lawrence. Maybe we can start with this. I've heard nootropic, I've heard smart drug. What's a smart drug?
Well, actually, it's funny. There's probably two ways of describing it. One is what I think is the reality is that a smart drug is a clever way for internet web marketers to separate people from their money. But if we want to actually talk about the more honest category, which I think has been known as nootropics for a while, and then we have to decide what's the best set of nomenclature because it's such an emergent thing that's not very well understood. It is the recognition of the fact that neurochemistry is an actual real thing, and that we can use a combination of neuroscience and molecular biochemistry and pharmacology to design neurochemical interventions that change the way that the brain works, and therefore change the way that your cognition and your psychology work in desired directions. So, the old, I guess it was the 60s phrase, better living through chemistry, plausibly actually delivered on.
So as I understand it, nootropics are a little bit more like, hey, how can I upgrade my brain? Is that right?
Yeah, I tend to come at things from the top down. and or the very, very bottom up. So the idea of nootropics is to say, can we upgrade your conscious experience in general? Or more specifically, can we actually upgrade your adaptive capacity, your ability to be effective in the world? And then so below that intent is the set of more concrete things that make that possible. But it's very important to recognize that adaptation to the world is a always moving target. So sometimes being more alert is good. It's adaptive. Sometimes being more alert is maladaptive. So it's less about the ability to deliver on some specific kind of local concrete upgrade, and actually more about the ability to have a sense of what is the total portfolio of capacities that make up a particular state, and then how do we actually try to one, upgrade your portfolio so you have more ability to respond to the world, and then improve the total set so that your total sort of responsive capacity is more adaptive to the total set of environmental conditions you might find yourself in.
When I think back at this, like you said, I guess the idea sprung in the 60s. And I remember being in college and going like, wow, I really need to, I don't know, drink more coffee or take some sort of drugs or something to kind of get my focus going here. And a lot of it was cultural, right? Like I had school or I had some sort of pressure on me and I wanted to increase my performance. So I guess just starting at the high level here, is the idea here that, look, our culture and our pressures have increased beyond evolution, and sure, Mother Nature gave us a great brain, but that brain doesn't work in our culture, so we need to do something in order to enhance performance to meet the demands that we've got?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of putting it. I would actually put it in more of a longer term narrative, which is that Mother Nature gave us a great brain, which has always been and will always be in relationship to some kind of pharmacology. Whether it's just simply, are you consuming fats or carbohydrates, which is going to very significantly change the way that your brain behaves, or are you consuming coffee or chocolate, which are different chemistries that the brain has been co-evolving with since we've had brains. And so there's two movements. One movement is that there's a continuous co-evolutionary process between the body-brain system and the set of environmental factors that we interact with. And then the second is that that co-evolutionary process, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, began to quite radically accelerate outside of what we call it the equilibrium feedback, or the safe space, the safe zone that evolution had prepared us for. And you were now kind of in an environment where we bootstrapped ourselves well outside of what nature prepared us for. And we're now increasingly having to take rather deep responsibility for where we've put ourselves.
And so that's interesting. So one way of approaching that upgrade would be, I guess, using some sort of chemical biology. Are there other premises around what we'll need to do to upgrade our brains beyond the chemical piece?
Sure, absolutely. The scope is holistic. We have to actually take into account the whole system. So, whether you're talking about breathing, breathing is actually a very fundamental tech. The Jamie Wheel, who's a friend of ours and a partner of the project, talks about all kinds of different ways that different, very specific breathing, like breathing in through your nose and then holding for a little while and then breathing out sharply through your mouth, changes the presence of nitrous oxide in your bloodstream. So that's a physical act that changes chemistry in a particular direction. But you also have things that change. Different forms of breathing will change brainwave states. You've got tonality, making different sounds, like vibrating the nasal passages does something. So you could think of it as an unrestricted toolkit of different ways that you can engage in behaviors that modify physical reality, that modify the mind-brain system, that then modify your cognitive and psychological state. Right? So it's just kind of a loop of that sort. And ideally what happens is that you modify your cognitive and psychological state so as to have a better perception of the possible ways to go back into that loop and better capacity to make decisions on how to drive that loop. So you actually get a continuous up gradient loop, if that makes any sense.
It does. Obviously, you've experimented a bunch with this. What is it? First of all, what does it even feel like? What do people imagine? What should they imagine with respect to what it feels like to be on a nootropic, to be, I guess, let's just use the word hacked a little bit cognitively. So what is that? What should they imagine in their heads? What does it feel like?
Okay, well, I'll start from the notion of broad and work my way in. So again, the category includes all possible ways of modifying the system so as to improve adaptive performance, which means it includes everything from increasing emotional resilience to increasing empathy, to increasing creativity, to increasing divergent thinking, to increasing focus. There's actually a whole bunch of different subsidiary elements, each one of which is in the broad category. So, and they all feel very different, right? So if you're taking a nootropic which radically increases your empathy, obviously you're going to feel more connected to other people and have a better sense of their emotional state. Whereas by contrast, if you take a nootropic that really quite radically increases let's say it increases your focus and motivation, but actually decreases your empathy, then that's going to feel different. And what's interesting is that the idea of parallax, you're familiar with that concept, like one eye and two eyes, so you actually get three dimensions if you have two eyes instead of one.
Yes.
If you explore the larger space of nootropics, you actually experiment with, okay, what does it feel like to have my empathy increased, but my divergent thinking decreased, or in this tribe, my focus increased, but my empathy decreased. You'll actually get this massive explosion, a combinatorial explosion of parallax of a much better sense of what all the different subcomponents look like, feel like, and how they fit together. And then the hard work begins, which is figuring out how to not over-bias in a particular direction, but actually how to weave up a combination of a base state that is like a place to return to, like your sort of foundation that is your general purpose, best place to be. And then how to understand when it is time to push into a particular more focused or more narrow state, depending on the context. And that's that's an art. This is not, and nor will it ever be a discrete sort of mathematical science. It is always going to be an art, because this is that great recursion. We are always only responding from who we are, and since what we're modifying is who we are, there's no way to get out of it. Like, you're just going to be playing with the uncertainty of whether or not the state that you're in right now is really responsive to the conditions you find yourself in.
So is the notion that you might take a pill or do something to yourself that you can, discover those performance areas, but then somehow incorporate it into your normal state? So in other words, not need to go on an ayahuasca trip or microdose on LSD or whatever, because you've found yourself, you've tapped into some other area and now are incorporating it into your steady state. Or do you feel like, nope, this is something where we really need to be, I don't know, just making it part of our let's just use the word diet, just what we're disciplined in doing all the time by enhancing ourselves with these different techniques or chemicals or whatever to be our normal state?
Well, it depends on how much energy you want to put into it and how much you care. I think that, as far as I can tell, and I'm only 46 years old, so there's a gigantic universe of stuff that I have no experience with whatsoever. But as far as I can tell, it is possible to integrate these things into your normal state broadly. So even the super intense stuff, it is possible through practices and through deliberate effort to be able to make that part of your base, your normally accessible state. But maybe you don't have 40 years to dedicate to focusing on making that possible, and it's not that important to your adaptive capacity to be in life to have it be part of your base state. And so you'll just reserve it as something that you'll access through some kind of ally. So in this case, perhaps it's microdosing. And so you'll say, it's okay, I'm never going to spend the time and energy to become capable of getting into the microdosing state through simple force of will. So what I'll do is I'll just keep that ready at hand to be able to use when I need it. And I'll only need it, say, 10% of the time. And that's a very valid approach.
Given how huge of a market this seems like it would be, why is there Like not that much research or scientific community just embracing this, or do I have this wrong?
Oh, no, no, you've got it dead on. I think there's a bunch of different reasons. So let's see if we can peel some of them apart. Um, One of them is that there was a meaningful backlash to the 60s. The kids in the 60s rushed into something big, powerful, important, and new with, frankly, very little discipline or discernment, which created a lot of good stuff, assuming you like rock and roll and computers. It also created a lot of bad stuff, and so you then kind of had the counterculture backlash, and a lot of things associated with the use of chemistry to modify subjective experience are still tarred with that brush. And I think we can actually point to empirical reality for this. The people who are the survivors of the 60s quite disproportionately, for example, opposed things like marijuana legalization or psilocybin microdosing. Frankly, it's just a legacy of that bygone era. Whereas the millennials are radically less concerned about those prohibitions, and maybe the millennials are unwise because they haven't experienced it. But in any event, that particular kind of generational bias exists. Another one, which is separate but related and very important, is the notion that consciousness as a concept is itself actually quite tainted in the sciences. And this is changing, and it's actually changing quite rapidly. But certainly a decade ago, the old-fashioned mid 19th century to mid 20th century tension between religion and science still broadly categorized consciousness in the religion category, and therefore a scientist who played with consciousness was equivalent to somebody who's trying to find out how much the soul weighed. And it's the kind of thing that just makes you not get promotion in the scientific academy. And the scientific academy is what's the right term for it? Pretty cutthroat. So being on the wrong side of that aesthetic is not the kind of place that late 20th century scientists wanted to be. And then the third is within the subdomain of, let's just call it medicine, there is and has been now for quite some time, actually since the 60s, a pretty significant cultural gulf between serious medicine, which allies closely with serious pharmacology, and naturopathy, homeopathy, etc., which is not serious and frankly mostly not true. And so you've got an issue that anything that smacks of coming from the alternative medicine, Chinese medicine, naturopath, homeopathy world, again carries a quite tainted brand in the universe of serious people who don't either want to take the personal risk or don't actually believe that it's worth taking the personal risk to test those kinds of hypotheses. And I guess the last is that it's certainly my experience and my opinion that most of the scientific academy has lost a lot of the kind of the fundamental courage and commitment to truth that characterized the major arc of science from the 19th century to the middle, maybe into the late 1970s. And broadly speaking, has become more of an institution than an instrument, to use Carol Quigley's term, meaning people are much more concerned with doing the right thing than with doing the true thing.
Huh. Does that mean that cultures that have less of a puritanical influence on their research might be further along? For example, I know piracetam has been studied in Europe for a super long time and used over there. So what are the big cultural differences between us and Europe?
Well, I think the short answer is I'm not really the right guy to give you an answer to that. I don't know. What I do know is that there's both a cultural and call it a regulatory distinction that is quite diverse. So places like Brazil and Russia have a hell of a lot more actual research done in these categories, and also the individuals in the culture are less concerned about what the formal structures tell them to do. This is also true in a lot of the Asian places, but it's really, each one is unique. Every discrete region. Even Europe, which is kind of covered under a single EU, each European country has its own different cultural history and its own different regulatory or institutional perspective on these kinds of things. It is highly heterogeneous.
Is part of it also like pharma here is all about curing things? A lot of what the framework we're using in this conversation is about enhancing things. I just wonder, like, if pharma's looking at dementia, right, and they're like, hey, take this pill, it's supposed to help with dementia, with Alzheimer's or this or that, they would not be approaching it with a framework that uses kind of the nootropic look, use all of these performance enhancing things. They'd be looking at somehow, I don't know, sequestering the problem or the outputs of dementia, like trying to kind of minimize them versus, I don't know, change the overall chemistry of the brain.
Well, we've got a bunch of different factors that are applying simultaneously. So let's kind of take them each piece by piece. And again, I have not actually been inside the pharma industry. So what I'm articulating right now is more of a derivative of a model of how industries in general work, and some amount of experience with actual people inside big pharma. So take this with a grain of salt. But the basic idea is you've got the primary driver of pharma is the fact that you're dealing with something which is an evolved industry inside a co-evolving regulatory framework, right? This is just how everything works. And so first and foremost, pharma is looking for things where the size of the market and the return on investment justifies the rather extraordinary cost necessary for them to go through the regulatory gates to be able to sell anything at all. That's actually quite important. So, if we could provide a solution to dementia that was effectively free, pharma could not pursue it because they have to be able to actually extract billions of dollars of revenue for their products. Otherwise, they can't justify the cost of actually going and doing the research. And this is decisively important. The second element is that because of the regulatory environment and the way that regulatory trials are done, and frankly, the current state of our epistemology of causation, pharma is broadly limited to relatively simple causal mechanisms. And when I say relatively simple, I mean the specific intervention, right? So they tend to focus on one, two, or two molecule products that they can then do all the work they do to be able to prove all the things they need to prove to be able to get regulatory approval to bring them to market. But what that means is that if a particular solution requires, say, 4 or 5 distinct interacting causal factors, they just can't even touch it. And that's obviously a gigantic universe of possibilities that is not within the scope of what they can research. What was the other one that mattered? Oh, and I guess it's also important to recognize, and this is linked back to the first, which is that unfortunately it actually is the case that in order to be able to maintain the business model, curing things is actually not anywhere near as lucrative as maintaining health through pharmaceutical engagement. And so it's if pharma could make a product that could cure dementia that cost $100,000, or could make a product that ameliorated the negative consequences of dementia, but you had to be on it forever and therefore made $10 million, they're almost economically required to go for the latter over the former. They may in fact be in breach of their fiduciary duty to shareholders if they do the alternative. So we've got a lot of complexity, both in terms of the scientific approach that we've received over the past 100 years and what's worked and what hasn't worked, the physical economic costs of executing that scientific approach, and then the regulatory and financial framework of what can and can't be done. And that's kind of the whole loop on that side. And then you flip to the other side, which is in the current environment, we're just really just starting to get into it. The advent of ubiquitous and relatively free information, things like biohackers being able to communicate broadly with lots of biohackers past a critical mass. The quantified self movement, and so the ability to turn quantifiable data into sensors or feedback mechanisms that live at the edge in extremely large numbers, is actually changing the landscape of what we can do. in a very important way. Like it's not a trivial shift. It's a fundamental shift in the nature of how much information of what kind and with what kind of fidelity we can actually generate. And then of course you have computational resources and machine learning that really quite radically opens up new potentials in being able to explore, in particular, much more complex causal frameworks than the kind of the legacy pharmaceutical methodologies could explore.
So is the toothpaste out of the tube in the same way that, I mean, when you're talking, it's reminding me a little bit of the way that like the music industry was disrupted, right? Through a number of things, the internet, how people publish it, who has rights, the music labels, all that stuff. Like now is just people are scrambling trying to figure out how to control it because the toothpaste went out of the tube on it. Is that the way you see things headed for not just nootropics, but just overall as we're looking at even pharma?
I'll go broader than that. I think I would say that we're headed there for everything. And the fact that we're headed there for everything is important for everything because there's a feedback loop. So the way I think about it in this particular way is I very much use evolutionary models because there's, if I've got a niche, let's say, for example, I've got the Ice Age. When I've got the Ice Age, woolly mammoths emerge and are successful. But when the Ice Age ends and we have a warm period, woolly mammoths go away. And it really doesn't matter what the woolly mammoths want to do. If the niche has changed, the niche has changed. And I think that's a very good conceptual framework for what's going on broadly. So the consequences of exponential technology, particularly in the domain of information, that began in the late 1970s and continues to accelerate, are a very, very fundamental change in the niche. And those institutional structures, music industry, banking, pharmaceuticals, medical, it doesn't matter, effectively all institutional structures that evolved in the niche of scarce information are almost always going to be quite significantly unfit for the emergent niche of abundant information. And then it's just a matter of time. Like when certain industries, like say newspapers, got hit quickly because their particular kind of thing was very much pure information. And it wasn't that hard for the information wave to touch that, transform it into pure information, just suck all the energy out of that system. Frankly, music would have done exactly the same thing, but for the fact that the music industry actually connected deeper into the stack to law and started using its ability to influence law to start making it so that the natural movement of music into the information wave couldn't happen, and it got held back by pure regulatory pressure. In the case of medicine and pharma, we're dealing with things that on the one hand are vastly more informationally complex than say music or news, and also with things that are more deeply connected to stuff that is not information, your physical body. And so they're closer to or further from the frontier of the information wave. But the information wave is now hitting them. And as tools like quantified self tools and instruments and different kinds of feedback loops, apps that people use to provide information, different kinds of behaviors of people choosing to access and use information for themselves and taking more responsibility over their own bodies than they defer to authorities, stuff like that. Like as those artifacts begin to emerge that enable the transfer of energy or the transfer of power to happen, then you're going to get somewhere on an S curve where you start getting into the bend of the curve, and then you'll see an accelerating pull, kind of like crossing the event horizon into a black hole, an accelerating pull of the energy out of the legacy system. In this case, it's going to be the kind of the well-being system in general, which broadly for us is medicine and pharmacology, into some new configuration, which is built upon the more fundamental architectures of abundant information.
Curious on your thoughts on who the players become and where the war kind of moves as the, profitable institutions like pharma, just you named them a whole bunch, right? Music, this, that, right? All of these things become disintermediated Is it governments that are like, holy shit, we need to keep the control and we need to kind of step in here and try to regulate and put boxes around this stuff? And it's kind of like the people versus the state, and that's the tug of war that happens once everything's peanut buttered all over the place. Or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think so. I think that's exactly the right way of describing it. I think we've reached that stage. So first, I think that on just like a level playing field, the information wave, and we can also call it the decentralization wave. It actually is the information wave, but decentralization happens to be very tightly linked to abundant information. So the information wave is already passing through most of the primary components of human life, with medicine and food being kind of the hard nuts at the center that haven't yet been touched, and physical security, military, things like that. But so, for example, like say Bitcoin has already touched the money function, which is very, very much at the center of governance. And while we are not yet past the nape of the curve, we're getting there. And it's pretty obvious that we're getting there to most of the people who care about that kind of thing. And so as the energy of money and finance starts getting sucked over into the information environment, you'll see an accelerating breakdown of the kind of the alliance and the attractor of the 20th century institutional form. And that'll show up as a kind of crisis. And frankly, I even think like if you want to have a good understanding of why it is that our political systems seem to be going insane, I think this is actually a big part of it. That there is an actual crisis going on in the underlying infrastructure and assumptions. Again, the niche in which the late 20th century neoliberal global nation state structure emerged, that is pushing that entire structure into crisis. And I said earlier that it's kind of happening everywhere, and the fact that it's happening everywhere is important. And this is a kind of a very deep point, and it's important to grasp, which is social systems hang together. The education system and the labor system are connected. You go to elementary school so you can go to middle school, so you can go to high school, so you can go to college, so you can graduate from college, so you can get a job, right? If jobs didn't give a fuck about college degrees, if there was zero upside to getting a college degree and getting a job, if that was delinked, then the education system would have changed long ago. But because they are linked and because they hang together, it actually creates a feedback loop where changing either one is actually very difficult. You can't change education unless you change labor. You can't change labor unless you change education. So that set of feedback loops between and among the different subcomponents of the social system maintains the integrity of the whole social system as being a self-perpetuating attractor, to use complex systems language. And so then if you think about it as like a field, you can imagine like a sheet of paper, and kind of on the bottom left corner you have a bunch of feedback loops, and there's a hard center, like think of it like a whirlpool. And that's our 20th century social structure. And then in the top right corner, you have another whirlpool. And that's this emergent abundant information social structure that hasn't yet occurred. And what's happening is that certain pieces at the edge of the bottom left corner are moving across the threshold and becoming part of the new attractor, part of the new whirlpool. And as they do that, both the old whirlpool begins to lose its energy because it's got less stuff that's orbiting it, less feedback loops to maintain its integrity, and the new one begins to build its energy. And that's really, really important because things like, how does an individual human being behave and participate in the decentralized economy? It's not like they behaved and participated in the centralized economy. You have to have a lot more capacity loaded on the individual. Each individual has to have more capacity to be able to take more responsibility for what they choose to do in the world. One, because their degrees of freedom are going to be wide open, but two, because the boxes are not going to be as coercive. Right? You're not just going to kind of get handed off from one machine to another machine with a very small amount of choices in between. You're going to be floating around in a whole field where every day you can choose to say, okay, today I'm going to actually do learning. I'm going to focus on education. Is what I'm doing today. Oh, well, tomorrow I'm going to actually very specifically focus on self-care and level up my capacity to engage in a better way of maintaining my well-being. Okay, well then for the next 2 hours, I'm actually going to be engaging in what otherwise used to be known as work. And I'll add my value to some set of projects which are useful and therefore provide me with more resources to do the other stuff I want to do. So it's going to be a really rather vastly different way of being in the world. And as more and more people are beginning to grasp that and take on the leveling themselves up into a higher degree of responsibility, which also means a higher and higher degree of empowerment, then they have less need for, patience with, or connection to the legacy structures of centralized authority, which breaks those legacy structures' utility and capacity and begins the process of forming what do these new structures look like as a collaboration between empowered, responsible individuals.
Is it conceivable to think about then governments or the controlling aspects of social structures that we have, the governing aspects, to be in the future a non-geographically bound entity that spans, that we kind of participate in and maybe move from thing to thing? So it's like I'm part of a governing system that is not necessarily the United States, but it's some structure that I'm a part of, that I associate with, that I kind of get benefits from, and people can move from structure to structure? Or do you see all of those things kind of coagulating into a one economy, one system that we then kind of move within?
Well, I kind of want to, I think it's important to make sure that everybody's, how do we do this right? It will definitely not look like one world government in a 20th century sense, right? That's for sure. There's very good reasons to believe that that's the case. And probably the most important is that the 20th century model of governance doesn't have enough bandwidth. It doesn't have enough capacity to receive and process information and make good decisions to deal with the actual complexity of the world. So it's just structurally impossible. It's kind of like trying to, I don't know what's the right for the right metaphor. It's like trying to fly an airplane with a calculator. It's just not going to get it done. So what can get it done is actually the better question. And the answer is much closer to the meshwork that you described. Some actually rather decentralized as can be done, meshwork of governance units that then have APIs on how they relate to each other. And some meaningful portion of it will in fact still be geographic, because we still have physical bodies and there are still major questions of physicality like food and water and physical safety. But some major portion of it will also be highly virtualized. And there's actually a kind of a cool term called subsidiarity, which is the principle of governance should be pushed into the lowest level where it can actually be done. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor. And yet at the same time, there will actually be a lot of things that will actually be totally global, because it just happens to be the most effective way to manage them. And those will tend to be very lightweight, and very virtual, but also global in scale. Like, say, the internet. There's no real point in there being 2 or 3 very, very separate internets, and there's a very high-quality attractor to have a highly decentralized system, which has simple protocols to enable information to flow seamlessly across it, being a single unified protocol.
Jordan, you have to be on heavy nootropics right now because you're clearly way smarter than I am. Let me ask you a question. How did you go from, like, I used to be in tech. I guess I kind of still am. And then I moved out a little bit and have been doing different stuff. And I know you probably think of yourself somewhat similarly. How do you go from, like, your past life, part of the tech community, and now all of a sudden into nootropics and this whole other different world? How did you get pulled into it?
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, in point of fact, I think it's more that I always was part of it. So here's a good example. In 2005, I was having conversations with the good folks at Google about potentially buying my company DivX. And unbeknownst to myself, and I live in San Diego, right? So I am not and have never been actually part of Silicon Valley, qua Silicon Valley. I've never lived there. I've never spent more than a couple of weeks there. Mm-hmm. Obviously, my business is tech, and so I have a great degree of familiarity with it, but I'm not actually in it up to the neck. Mm-hmm. And so I show up, and I'm sitting in the waiting room to have a conversation with Sergey, I think, and I have my hands a book of French philosophy by a philosopher named Gilles Deleuze. And I'm just sitting there reading this book, and Chris Sacca, who was at Google still at the time and happened to be the guy who was helping navigate this thing, came in and started talking to me about what's going to happen. He looked at it, and he noted that he was a little bit surprised that I was reading such a thing. And I think that's a good narrative. That is much closer to the center who I have always been. Mm-hmm. I did philosophy undergrad. I also did comp sci, AI, economics, political science, political theory, agriculture, but always at the top of the stack because I was just most interested in those things which are the most durable and either most fundamental or most emergent. And then from a personality perspective, I just grew up as a nerd. I just happened to be the guy who liked computers, video games of all sorts, role-playing games, board games, comic books, science fiction, all that kind of stuff. And so my identity, the who I am, was just very deeply connected with nerd culture. My predilection was focusing on things that are either fundamental or emergent. And those two things in 1994 happened to overlap in doing things in tech. And so that's how I got into tech by virtue of that. But in many ways, it was always a means to an end. Like my objective has always been focusing on where is this thing going and how do we do the best job as a whole in this giant story of humanity in the universe. And then subsidiarily, what role does technology play broadly? And then below that level, what role can I play in the evolution of technology in alignment with that bigger picture?
Help everybody get super geeky too. What kind of stuff are you reading? Should they be reading? How do they learn more about neurohacker? Like, just aim folks to places.
Great. So it turns out there's actually a very nice, easy answer to that right now with regard to neurohacker, which is Jamie's book, Stealing Fire. He covers a lot of the primary territory, and he probably covers it in a fashion which is both true and digestible. So it's the kind of thing that it'll be one of those things that if you haven't read it in the next year, people will be wondering what the hell you've been up to. And you can think of that as call it level up tech, the whole set of tech that's existed since the Greek Eleusinian mysteries, and then all the way up to the contemporary environment on how do we actually collectively go about solving the problem of having enough individual capacity to deal with the shit we're dealing with. Mm-hmm. Okay, so aside from that, nerding out, beyond that, when I nerd out big time. There's a pretty good comic book called Unflattening. I actually think comic books are an excellent vehicle for understanding stuff because they have the ability to use visual and text simultaneously, which actually are two very different modalities of expression. And Unflattening specifically plays with that and gives you a better sense of why it is I said what I just said. If you want to go even deeper, I would take a look at the contemporary or the best current works on the lineage from Marshall McLuhan. If you remember him, The Medium is the Message.
Oh, yeah.
His stuff was hot and then got cold, but then a whole bunch of people have held on to it. And it's actually, frankly, fundamental. Like the linkage between psychology or neuropsychology, how our brain forms our psychological experience, the relationship between that and the developmental environment of the technology that mediates our relationship to the world. The kind of tech that we used, particularly during our first 20 years of life, and what that implies for how we make sense of the world and how we act in the world is actually fundamental. Like if you get that, you can make some really good predictions about what's going on next. I think that next right now, this is actually quite interesting. I believe we're actually in a moment of pretty significant acceleration. It's very difficult for people to write books that are able to keep up with the pace of change. There's a bunch of good ones. I really quite like The Secrets of Our Success, which is a collection of some of the best thinking right now on developmental anthropology and what it is precisely that makes Homo sapiens sapiens a cultural animal. And by the way, the deep insight there is the fact that Homo sapiens discovered two different male hierarchical structures. One is a dominance hierarchy, the other is a prestige hierarchy, and that turns out to be very, very important. But what I'm actually seeing right now is it's more of a list of the people who have already done enough work to be able to do a really high quality of curation, and then are filtering both real time and slower. So like Alex Lightman, for example, is continuing to do a very good job of orienting things towards what's true, and away from and to what's important. Honestly, what I would do is the exact opposite. Rather than sort of think of the things that should be, I'd actually think of the things that shouldn't be. My primary recommendation to everybody is turn almost everything off. Most forms of information curation, most of the techniques, particularly everything that is commercial at any scale, and definitely anything that's commercial at any scale that existed before, call it 2010, is bad for you. It's not going to be working in your best interests, and it's probably optimized to make it hard for you to make sense yourself. Like it's actually jacking your limbic system. So broadly speaking, turn off your TV almost entirely. Don't read newspapers, and be extremely careful. Like don't participate in Facebook or most of the Twitterverse. Like it's almost like, the learnings that we had in nutrition. Stop eating sugar, be more thoughtful about the kinds of fats you take in. That level of nutritional discernment has to be applied to your informational diet, at least at that level, and probably even higher, because it moves so much faster.
Amen, brother. Walk away from all the institutions.
Yeah.
Jordan, I want to thank you for being on Grow Big Always. This is awesome stuff. I invite everybody to check out Neurohacker Collective and all those resources. There's a lot of reading it sounds like I need to catch up on. So thanks a whole bunch for being on Grow Big Always.
You're quite welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
A huge thank you to Jordan for doing the show. And thanks to you guys for heading over to the iTunes store to write a review of the Grow Big Always podcast. It really helps with our discoverability. If you haven't done that, be sure to head over there and do it. And while you're online, check out the growbigalways.com website where all of the previous episodes are listed, as well as the opportunity to sign up for our weekly newsletter. I'm incredibly grateful for everyone who shared the show. Thanks for listening.